Here it was again, the same nightmare. It waited for her every time she closed her eyes. Smoke rolled across the blackened sky, thick enough to choke on. Fire consumed everything she had ever known, reducing homes, memories, and faces to cinders. She could hear the screams again, her mother's voice among them, distant and fading. Rough hands seized her, dragging her away while she clawed at the dirt and ash. The smoke trailed behind her like a funeral shroud. Then came the chains. Cold iron bit into her flesh, cutting into her wrists until she bled. The clink of links echoed through the darkness, followed by laughter, cruel, delighted laughter. Nora awoke with a gasp. For a moment she didn't know where she was. Cold sweat soaked her skin, and her chest heaved as though she'd been running. The phantom weight of shackles still clung to her limbs. She could almost feel the iron grinding against bone. Her hands trembled. She pressed a palm against her chest, trying to slow the frantic beating of her heart. 5 years. 5 years, and the fear still lived inside her. It had rooted itself deep within her, coiled around her heart like a serpent that refused to die. She wiped the sweat from her brow with the edge of her rough blanket. "I have to finish this," she whispered. The words sounded hollow in the darkness. No one answered. The room remained silent. She rose from her bed and dressed in the dim light before dawn. Worn leather and coarse linen settled over her scarred body, covering the pale, twisted lines that marred her skin. Every scar had a memory attached to it. Most of them she wished she could forget. She looked around the room. A narrow bed, a battered chest, a cracked wash basin, nothing more. It wasn't home. It never had been. It was simply a place where the nightmares could find her. At the door, she hesitated. Outside these walls waited a world that had taught her a single lesson. Mercy was a weakness. She opened the door. Pale sunlight spilled through the cracked windows of the hallway, but it brought little warmth. Dust drifted through the beams of light, like ash from a distant fire. From below came the muted chatter of early patrons, and the occasional clink of mugs. The sounds seemed far away, as though she were hearing them through water. She descended the stairs. At the bottom stood Mimi. The half-orc towered over nearly everyone in the guild hall, broad and powerful, her green skin marked by old scars of her own. Yet her eyes carried a warmth that never seemed to fade. Nora approached and gave a slight bow. "Good morning, madam." Despite owning her, Mimi had never treated her cruelly. "I've told you 100 times to stop calling me that, kid." A weary smile crossed the woman's face. "It's been 5 years. Just call me Mimi." "Yes, madam." The smile faded. Mimi sighed and slid a folded piece of parchment across the counter. "Your next assignment." Nora unfolded it. One name. Ferris Halcyon, king of the Halcyon Kingdom. Even seeing the name made her stomach tighten. Stories followed the king like shadows. They spoke of dungeons beneath his palace, and the screams that escaped them in the dead of night. They spoke of elven women disappearing from villages, never to be seen again, and they spoke of torture. No one knew why he coveted elves. No one who knew the answer had lived long enough to tell it. Nora folded the parchment. A mission was a mission. Yet something cold stirred in the pit of her stomach. She pulled her cloak over her head as she stepped outside, hiding the mutilated points of her ears beneath its shadow. The city was only beginning to wake. Mist clung to the streets and the stone pathways glistened with the night's rain. Beggars huddled in doorways, wrapped in threadbare blankets, their hollow eyes following passers-by with the desperate stare of starving animals. Nora kept walking. Then she saw them. A girl, perhaps 10 years old. She sat on the cold stone with her knees drawn to her chest. Deep auburn hair hung in tangled strands around a pale face, and her striking violet eyes seemed far too old for someone so young. At her feet lay a boy with the same auburn hair. He was trembling. His skin had the waxy pallor of a corpse, and each breath rattled weakly in his chest. The girl looked up. Their eyes met. A chill crept down Nora's spine. Something was wrong. Not merely poverty, not sickness, something darker. The instincts that had kept her alive for 5 years suddenly screamed at her to turn around and walk away. But she couldn't, because for the briefest of moments the girl's violet eyes reminded her of someone she had once known, someone who had burned in the smoke of her dreams. She found herself walking toward them before she realized it. The girl looked up at her and trembled. "Please, help my brother." Her voice broke into a sob as her gaze flickered to the weapons hanging at Nora's sides. The boy looked sickly enough, Pale skin, shaking limbs, shallow breaths, but appearances meant little. Even children could deceive. For a long moment, Nore simply stared at them. Then, against her better judgment, she reached into her coin purse and drew out a single gold piece. The girl's eyes widened. "Take this," Nore said, her voice flat. She glanced at the boy again. Something about him made her uneasy, though she couldn't say why. "Do what you can." She turned to leave. "Wait." The word stopped her. The girl's voice had changed. It was calm now, too calm. Deep and strange, as though someone else was speaking through her trembling body. "Let me give you a gift." Despite the steady tone, the child was shaking so violently her teeth chattered. Nore frowned and held out her hand. The girl placed something small and cold into her palm. Before Nore could look at it, a howl split the air. Long, mournful, ancient. Her blood turned to ice. The hounds of Haven. Another howl answered the first, somewhere in the distance. Then another. The sound clawed at old wounds buried deep within her. She closed her hand around the object and quickly turned away, leaving the children behind without another word. She did not look back. The streets eventually led her to a small tavern. Warm light spilled from its windows, and the dull roar of conversation drifted into the evening air. She stepped inside and took a seat at the bar, keeping her hood low as she listened to the patrons around her. Nothing unusual. Merchants complaining about taxes, travelers boasting of roads they'd never seen, drunken fools laughing too loudly. Then the doors burst open. A burly man strode inside, followed by a half-dozen rough-looking companions. Mud stained their boots, and the smell of horses and sweat followed them like a cloud. The man dropped onto a stool. "Hey, wench," he bellowed. "Bring me your finest ale." The barkeep silently filled a mug to the brim. The man drained it in one long swallow, before slamming it onto the counter. He grinned at his companions. Finally finished getting those elves to the kingdom of Halsin. Nora's fingers tightened around her cup. One of the men laughed. The burly man leaned closer to his companions and lowered his voice, though not enough. "The king loves his elf women." He chuckled darkly. Perfect for breeding. Everything inside her went still. The sounds of the tavern faded, the laughter, the chatter, even the crackling fire. For a single terrible moment, she could hear only the clinking of chains. A familiar sickness rose in her stomach. This was far worse than she'd been told. Far worse. She stood so abruptly that her chair scraped across the floor. Several heads turned. Ignoring them, she strode toward the door. Cold evening air struck her face as she stepped outside. Only then did she realize she had stopped breathing. She drew in a sharp breath. Her heart pounded painfully against her ribs. She had to get to Halsin. Immediately. The last traces of sunlight were fading as she made her way to the Merchant Guild. The large hall stood nearly empty, with only a few stragglers lingering before the night's departure. Nore approached a merchant seated at a small table and dropped a heavy pouch of coins in front of him. The man looked up. "Heading to Halsin." She nodded. Without another word, he pocketed the coins. Several minutes later, they left the guild together and made their way to a waiting wagon. The horses stamped their feet impatiently. The merchant climbed aboard first. Nore followed. As she settled into the wooden cart, an unexpected feeling washed over her. Relief. The road had never been kind to her. It had given her scars, blood, and memories she wished she could forget. Yet somehow she felt safer traveling beneath an open sky than sleeping behind locked doors. The merchant snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward. As the city slowly disappeared behind them, Nore slipped her hand into her pocket and touched the object the strange girl had given her. It was still cold, and for reasons she couldn't explain, that frightened her more than the howls. The wagon rattled along the dirt road, every rut and stone sending another jolt through its worn wooden frame. Now and then, Nore caught sight of small settlements on the horizon, tiny islands of light in an endless sea of darkness, their torches flickering like dying stars. The rhythmic creaking of the wheels and the steady clopping of hooves slowly dragged at her eyelids. Eventually, sleep claimed her, and the nightmare welcomed her back. She was there again. Smoke, fire, blood. The familiar pain twisted in her chest. This time she saw her mother. Her sword gleamed red in the firelight as she fought desperately to hold back the bandits surrounding her. She moved like a storm, cutting one down and then another, refusing to yield even as exhaustion slowed her limbs. Then Nore saw him. a large man stepping silently through the chaos, behind her mother. His sword raised high. "No," she tried to scream. No sound came. The blade began to fall. Nora jolted awake. She sucked in a sharp breath, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. For several frantic moments, she searched the darkness around her, expecting smoke, flames, and screaming. Instead, she found only the wagon. The merchant glanced back at her. Almost there, she wiped the cold sweat from her brow and forced herself to breathe. The wagon rolled to a stop. Ahead stood the gates of the castle town. "All right, lass," the merchant said, climbing down from his seat. "This is as far as I go." Nora nodded and stepped from the cart. The first thing she noticed was the silence. No guards, no sentries, not even a drunk leaning against the walls. The gates stood open and unattended. A chill crept down her spine. She passed beneath the stone archway, every instinct urging caution. The streets beyond were nearly empty. Doors and shutters were closed tight. No children played in the alleys. No merchants called from their stalls. The entire town felt as though it were holding its breath. Then she heard it, shouting. Far ahead, as she drew closer, the shouting grew louder, mingled with laughter and applause. She turned a corner and stopped. A crowd had gathered around a wooden platform. An execution. A man dressed entirely in black stood upon the blood-soaked stage, a broad sword resting casually in his hands. Dark stains covered the wooden planks beneath his feet. The executioner. A murmur swept through the crowd. Another prisoner was being brought forward. Nora's breath caught in her throat. An elf woman climbed the steps. No, it couldn't be. Maze, her mother's right hand, the woman who had fought beside her for years, the woman who had carried her on her shoulders when she was too tired to walk, the woman who had sworn to protect her, the woman who had disappeared the night everything burned. Maze's deep green eyes were dull and empty. Her once golden hair hung in filthy, tangled strands around her face. Bruises darkened her skin, and her body looked thin, almost fragile. She was barely recognizable. Rage flooded through Nora. This woman had once seemed unbreakable. Now she looked like a ghost. She shoved through the crowd, ignoring the curses thrown her way. She had to get closer. She had to. The executioner moved. A sickening crunch echoed across the square. Then came the cheers. The world seemed to stop. Something rolled across the blood-stained wood, then tumbled from the platform. Maze's head came to rest at Nora's feet. Its lifeless green eyes stared directly at her. For a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't think. The crowd erupted into applause. Someone laughed. Someone else shouted for another execution. A sound rose in her ears, long and piercing. It took her several seconds to realize it was her own heartbeat. Bile surged up her throat. She turned and fled. Behind her, she heard a loud sob break through the cheering crowd. She ignored it. She pushed through the sea of bodies, stumbling blindly. Her composure shattered the moment she reached the edge of the square. She doubled over. Violent retching racked her body until her stomach was empty. Even then, she couldn't stop shaking. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Maze was dead. The last person who had known her mother. The last living piece of her old life. Gone. A cold emptiness settled inside her. The town suddenly felt even darker than before. She needed food, a drink, sleep. Anything to keep herself from thinking. Anything to keep herself from seeing those lifeless green eyes. Nora wandered the streets until she found a tavern with a faded, weather-beaten sign hanging above its door. The lettering had long since peeled away, leaving the name impossible to read. A fitting place, she thought. Without another glance at the empty street behind her, she stepped inside. Nora approached the front desk and set a small bag of coins upon the worn wood. "1 room, please," she mumbled. The woman behind the desk looked up with tired, bloodshot eyes. "Speak up," she grumbled. Nora swallowed, forcing down the lump in her throat. 1 room, please. The innkeeper snatched the coin purse and shoved it beneath the counter before handing her a brass key. No smile, no welcome, only another weary face in a weary town. Nora climbed the stairs, the old boards groaning beneath her feet. At the end of the hall she found her room and slipped the key into the lock. The door creaked open. The room was modest, but far better than the one she had at the Guildhall. A proper bed stood against the wall, and a small hearth rested cold in the corner. Someone had even placed a vase of dried flowers on the windowsill. They had long since lost their colour. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. For a while, she simply sat on the edge of the bed. Mais's face lingered in her mind. No, not her face. Her eyes, lifeless and empty. Then the sickening sound of bone and steel. Nora clenched her fists until her nails bit into her palms. This was no longer a mission. It was revenge. Not only for Mais, but for every elf dragged to this kingdom in chains, for every life ruined by the monster sitting upon the throne. As evening deepened, exhaustion crept over her. Her limbs felt heavy, and her thoughts grew sluggish. Just for a moment, she told herself. She lay down. Sleep claimed her almost instantly, and once again she found herself in the darkness. This time she saw her father. He stood among the trees, a torch in one hand. Its flames cast long, writhing shadows across his gaunt face. He was smiling. That same smile, the one he had worn on the night he sold his family for power. A sickly man with hollow eyes and a rotten soul. The terror that usually gripped her dreams was gone. Only anger remained. It burned hotter than the flames around him. After that night she had sworn to find him, to make him answer for what he had done, to make him suffer. The dream dissolved into darkness. Nora awoke with a sharp breath. The anger remained. It simmered quietly inside her, glowing like embers beneath ash. Outside, the last traces of daylight had vanished. Night had fallen. She rose from the bed and left the tavern, ignoring the curious stares and hushed whispers that followed her. For a moment she stood beneath the moonlight. The air was cold. The plaza was nearly empty. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Then silence. Nora pulled her cloak closer and began walking. At this point, one thing was certain. She needed a way into the castle, and quickly. The employment guild stood near the center of the town, its stone facade stained by age and neglect. As soon as she stepped inside, she felt it. Eyes, watching, whispers, following her. Nothing about this place felt right. Yet somehow she knew the guild held the key to entering the castle. She approached the desk. The clerk looked up. "I'm looking to become a maid in the castle," she said. "Can you help?" The man looked her up and down before sighing. "You're lucky you came today." He leaned back in his chair. "The king just executed one of his servants." The words were spoken with disturbing indifference. His gaze lingered on her chest a moment too long. A slow smile spread across his face. "I'm sure you can fill the position." A shiver crawled down Nora's spine. The clerk reached beneath the desk and produced a folded letter, stamped with the guild's golden seal. "A recommendation. Present this at the castle." She took it without a word. The parchment felt strangely heavy in her hand. Nora left the guild and stepped back into the cool night air. If she was to pose as a servant, she needed proper clothing. She wandered the dim streets until her gaze settled upon a small, shabby storefront, tucked between two larger buildings. The paint on its windows had faded and peeled with age. Barely visible were the words, "Reese's Dress Shop." A weak light glowed behind the glass. Someone was still awake. Nora climbed the steps and reached for the door. For reasons she couldn't explain, a feeling of unease settled in her stomach. As she stepped inside, a small bell chimed above the door. The sudden sound made Nora flinch. A woman sat slumped behind the front desk, her head resting on one hand as a weary sigh escaped her lips. At the sound of the bell, she looked up. The moment she saw Nora, she nearly leaped from her chair. "Oh, hello, welcome to my dress shop." A spark of hope lit her eyes, so bright that it seemed out of place in this miserable town. Nora approached the desk and attempted a faint smile. "I need a castle regulation uniform." Her gaze drifted toward the dress forms standing near the wall. One displayed a maid's uniform, the other a servant's attire for men. Both looked immaculate, their dark fabrics trimmed with gold thread. For a long moment, the woman simply stared at her. Then she sprang into motion. "Oh my goodness." She scrambled across the room, nearly tripping over a basket of cloth, and snatched up a measuring tape. "You actually came here? Instead of one of those bigger shops?" She clasped her hands together, positively beaming. "I'm honored." Before Nora could respond, the woman seized her hand and pulled her toward a small wooden pedestal. "Stand right there, arms up." Without waiting for permission, she lifted Nora's arms and began taking measurements. Nora stood stiffly, unsure what to do with the woman's overwhelming enthusiasm. After several moments of silence, the seamstress spoke again. "So what brings you to Halcyon?" Her eyes glittered with curiosity. "I'm here to work," Nora replied flatly. The woman's smile faltered. The disappointment in her eyes was impossible to miss. For some reason, guilt pricked at Nora's chest. The silence that followed was almost painful. The seamstress finished her measurements and stepped back with a satisfied smile. "All done. Come back tomorrow night and your uniform should be ready." She returned to her desk and began scribbling furiously onto a sheet of parchment. Only then did Nora notice how worn the shop truly was. The curtains were faded. Several shelves sat nearly empty. The hems of the displayed dresses had been mended so many times that the stitching was visible. Business couldn't have been good. Without another word, she turned and left. The bell chimed softly behind her. The streets had grown darker. Clouds drifted across the moon, drowning the town in shadow. Nora pulled her cloak tighter and began making her way back to the tavern. Exhaustion weighed heavily upon her. All she wanted was sleep. Yet with every step, an uneasy feeling crept over her. She slowed. Someone was watching her. She could feel it. A gaze lingering on the back of her neck. She stopped. Silence. The streets were empty. Then she turned. Her breath caught. At the end of the street, half hidden in the darkness, stood a figure. Green eyes stared back at her. The same deep green she had seen only hours before. The same eyes that had gone dull upon the executioner's block. May's. For a terrible moment, neither of them moved. A cold wave of dread washed through Nora. Because she had watched May's die. She had watched her head roll across the blood-soaked platform. And yet, those eyes were unmistakable.